Alicia Reynolds was a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence wherever she went. Most people who saw her on the street had no idea that she was a federal judge, a person who held one of the most important positions in the justice system. She never flaunted her role or used it to demand respect. Instead, she preferred to live simply, blending in with people around her. In the courtroom, she was known for her strong voice, clear thinking, and unshakable fairness. Outside of the courtroom, however, she looked like any ordinary woman, dressed simply, speaking kindly, and walking with calm steps. That weekend, Alicia decided to travel to a nearby town to visit her sister. She had been working long hours on a series of difficult cases and needed a break. The town was small, quiet, and filled with family memories. Her sister lived in a modest house surrounded by tall trees, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and life moved slowly. Alicia loved visiting there because it reminded her of the days before her career consumed so much of her time. She wore jeans, a loose shirt, and comfortable shoes. To anyone passing by, she looked like a woman enjoying a weekend errand, not a judge who carried the weight of justice on her shoulders. As she walked through the town, Alicia felt a sense of peace. The local store stood at the corner of Main Street, and she stopped inside to pick up a few things for her sister. The shelves were filled with simple household items, the kind of things that didn't need labels or brands. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery section floated in the air. Alicia smiled as she greeted the cashier politely, paid for her items, and tucked them carefully into a small bag. She wasn't in a rush. She was enjoying the slower rhythm of the town. When she stepped outside the store, the cool breeze brushed across her face. She took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air. Her mind was far from the courtroom and all the stress it carried. She thought about the conversation she would soon have with her sister over a cup of tea, about family stories, about simple laughter. But life has a strange way of changing in an instant. What began as a quiet walk on a peaceful street was about to become an experience she would never forget. Across the street, a police car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their faces sharp with authority. They glanced in Alicia's direction, speaking in hushed voices to each other. Alicia noticed them but thought nothing of it. She had great respect for law enforcement. In her career, she had worked with many officers who were dedicated, hard-working, and honorable. She believed deeply in the rule of law, and she assumed everyone wearing the uniform carried the same values. The officers, however, seemed to view her differently. She didn't know what they were saying, but she could feel their eyes lingering on her. Alicia adjusted the bag in her hand and kept walking calmly down the sidewalk. She had no reason to worry, or at least that's what she thought. The streets were not crowded, but a few people were moving about, families heading to their cars, a couple leaving the cafe nearby, an elderly man sitting on a bench enjoying the morning sun. Alicia felt the ordinary rhythm of life, but she also began to sense that the two officers were now following her steps. She slowed down slightly, wondering if they were simply walking in the same direction. But their presence became heavier with every moment. In that quiet town, Alicia had always felt safe, but now something unsettled her. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. She had only bought a few things from the store. Still, the feeling of being watched closely made her uneasy. She thought about her position as a judge, about how she always believed in fairness and truth. But she also knew from her years of experience that sometimes people made judgments based on appearances, not facts. As she turned the corner, she caught the reflection of the officers in a shop window. They were not far behind. Her heartbeat quickened, though she tried to stay composed. Alicia was not someone who panicked easily. She had faced intense cases, strong arguments, and even threats during her career. She always handled them with calm strength. But this situation was different. She was not in her courtroom, not in her robe of authority. She was just a woman walking down a small town street, holding a bag of groceries. The air felt heavier. She heard the steady footsteps of the officers drawing closer. Alicia decided not to rush. She believed that dignity was her best shield. If they had something to ask, she would answer politely. If there was a misunderstanding, she trusted that it could be cleared up with words. She had always taught young lawyers that respect and calmness could resolve most conflicts. She held onto that belief as she walked on. Her mind drifted for a moment to her sister, waiting for her arrival. She imagined the warm kitchen, the kettle whistling, and the comfort of family conversation. She told herself that in just a few minutes, she would be there. Yet at the same time, she couldn't ignore the footsteps behind her. The officers were no longer just a presence, they were a shadow, closing in. Alicia lifted her chin slightly, a small sign of her inner strength. She thought about her journey to becoming a federal judge, about the struggles and victories along the way. She remembered the many times she had stood in court defending fairness, reminding everyone that justice must never bow to bias. It gave her courage now, as she prepared herself for whatever was coming. At that moment, Alicia was unaware that the next few minutes would change everything. She didn't know that her identity as a federal judge would soon come to light in a way she never imagined. For now, she was simply a woman on a sidewalk, carrying a bag, walking steadily forward, with two officers following close behind. The sun shone gently on the town. Birds sang from the trees. It looked like an ordinary day. But in Alicia's life, this day was about to become a story that revealed both the painful truths of prejudice and the unshakable strength of dignity. Alicia continued her walk with slow, steady steps, but the sound of boots behind her was growing louder. She kept her composure, even though she could feel her heart beating faster. In her mind, she told herself that she had done nothing wrong, and there was no reason to be afraid. Still, years of experience had taught her that sometimes situations turned unfair very quickly. She knew how fragile human judgment could be when shaped by assumptions instead of facts. The two officers finally called out to her. "Excuse me, ma'am," one said, his tone firm but sharp. Alicia stopped and turned around calmly, holding her bag in one hand. She looked at them directly, her face showing no fear. "Yes?" she asked softly. Her voice carried patience, but there was also strength in it. The officers exchanged quick glances before one of them stepped closer. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. Alicia blinked in mild surprise. It was a simple question, but the tone suggested suspicion rather than curiosity. "I just came from the store," she replied, lifting the bag slightly to show them. "I bought a few things for my sister." The officer narrowed his eyes, as though her answer was not enough. "Do you live around here?" "My sister does," Alicia said, still calm. "I'm visiting her today." The second officer shifted his stance, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes scanned her from head to toe. Alicia noticed the look but remained composed. She had seen that same look directed at others in her courtroom, people judged not by their actions, but by their appearance. "Can we see some identification?" the first officer asked. Alicia reached slowly into her purse, keeping her movements calm. She handed over her driver's license, which clearly showed her name. The officer studied it for a moment but didn't return it right away. Instead, he glanced at his partner, and they both seemed unconvinced. "What brings you here?" the second officer asked again, as if repeating the question would change her answer. "I already told you," Alicia said, her voice firm but polite. "I'm visiting my sister. She lives just a few blocks away." The crowd around them began to notice the tension. A few people slowed their steps, quietly watching from the sidewalk. Alicia could sense their eyes on her, but she focused on the two men in front of her. "Is there a problem?" she asked, raising her chin slightly. The first officer hesitated, then said, "We had a report about someone suspicious in this area." Alicia felt a pang of disbelief. She looked down at her bag of groceries, then back at them. There was nothing unusual about her, nothing to justify suspicion. She wondered if the so-called report was even real, or if it was simply an excuse. "I assure you, I've done nothing wrong," Alicia said calmly. But her words seemed to do little. Instead of ending the conversation, the officers appeared to grow more determined. The second one stepped closer. "We'll need you to come with us," he said. Alicia's eyes widened slightly, though she kept her voice steady. "On what grounds?" That question seemed to unsettle them. For the first time, they looked uncertain. But pride and stubbornness kept them from backing down. "Just come with us," the first officer repeated, his tone harder now. Alicia took a deep breath. She knew her rights. She had spent years defending the principles of justice, teaching others that power must never replace fairness. But here she was, standing on a sidewalk, being treated as if she had no voice. The officers reached for her arm. Alicia stepped back slightly, her face calm but firm. "Please don't touch me," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried weight. "I haven't broken any law." Her refusal only seemed to make them more impatient. In their eyes, resistance, even calm resistance, was a challenge. The first officer suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. The bag slipped from her hand, groceries spilling onto the ground. Gasps rose from the small crowd nearby. Alicia stumbled but did not lose her balance completely. She looked at the officer, her eyes steady. "This is unnecessary," she said. The second officer moved in quickly, pressing her other arm. Alicia felt a rush of humiliation. She had spent her career believing in dignity, believing that authority should be used to protect, not to intimidate. Now, in the middle of a quiet town, she was being treated as though her words carried no meaning. "Stop resisting," one of them barked, though she had done nothing but stand her ground. The people watching grew restless. A young man pulled out his phone, recording the scene. An elderly woman nearby shook her head in disbelief. A mother covered her child's eyes as the officers forced Alicia to the ground. The roughness of the sidewalk pressed against her hands, and she felt the sting of sharp gravel. Even then, Alicia did not raise her voice in anger. She refused to let the moment take away her dignity. Instead, she spoke clearly, even as her cheek touched the cold pavement. "You are making a mistake." Those words hung in the air. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispering to each other. Some called out, "She didn't do anything." Others shouted, "Leave her alone." The tension grew heavier with every passing second. The officers, however, seemed determined to prove their authority. They held her down, one pressing on her shoulder while the other searched through her purse. The sound of people recording with their phones grew louder. Someone yelled that they would call the news. Alicia's mind was racing, but she did not let fear take over. She reminded herself of who she was, of the oath she had taken to uphold justice. She knew that truth always found its way to the surface, even when covered by layers of prejudice. She breathed deeply, telling herself that this moment, painful as it was, would not break her spirit. As she lay on the ground, her thoughts moved to her courtroom. She remembered the faces of people who once stood before her, pleading to be seen, pleading to be heard. She had always promised herself to listen, to give everyone the respect they deserved. Now she felt the same plea in her own heart. The crowd grew braver, their voices rising. "She told you she's done nothing wrong," one man shouted. "You can't just treat people this way." But the officers acted as though they heard nothing. They tightened their grip, trying to maintain control. Alicia winced as the pressure on her arm grew stronger. Yet even in that moment, she kept her dignity. Her voice, calm but firm, rose again. "I am not resisting. I am only standing for my rights." The words carried across the street. The people listening felt the power in them. It was not just a woman speaking, it was a voice of truth, steady and unbroken. By now, Alicia knew that the situation had gone far beyond reason. These officers had not approached her with fairness or respect. They had acted out of assumption and rash judgment. What they did not know, what they could not imagine, was that the woman they had forced to the ground was someone who carried the weight of justice every day, a federal judge whose very life was built on upholding the law. That truth, still hidden from them, was about to change everything. But in this moment, on the hard pavement of a small town street, Alicia held on to the one thing that no one could take from her, her dignity. Alicia lay on the cold pavement, her cheek pressed against the rough surface, but her spirit remained unbroken. Around her, the voices of bystanders grew louder, echoing with anger and disbelief. People could not understand why such a calm woman, holding nothing more than groceries a moment ago, was now being pinned down by officers as if she were a dangerous criminal. The officers, however, seemed unmoved by the cries of the crowd. Their grip stayed firm, their faces tight with authority. Alicia could feel the weight of one officer pressing against her shoulder, while the other searched her bag as if looking for proof to justify their actions. But the bag contained nothing more than bread, fruit, and a carton of milk. The crowd noticed. "Look at that," a young woman shouted, pointing to the scattered groceries on the sidewalk. She was only shopping. Her words carried frustration, and several others murmured in agreement. Another man, holding up his phone to record the entire scene, spoke louder. "Everyone can see this. She hasn't done anything. This is wrong." His voice cut through the air, and the officers glanced nervously at the growing number of phones pointed in their direction. Alicia felt the sting of humiliation, not just from being forced to the ground, but from being treated as though her words meant nothing. She thought of the many times in her courtroom when she had looked into the eyes of people who had been mistreated, listening as they explained how it felt to be unheard. Now she was living that same truth, and the pain of it pressed heavier on her heart than the weight of the officers holding her down. Yet even in that moment, Alicia refused to lose her calm. Her voice, steady though soft, rose again. "You are treating me unfairly," she said. "I am not resisting, and I have done nothing wrong." Her words caused a stir among the crowd. The people watching could feel her dignity, her strength, and it only deepened their anger toward what was unfolding before them. Some stepped closer, their voices rising in protest. "Let her go," a teenager shouted. "This is abuse of power," another added. The officers, sensing the tension, tried to keep control. "Step back," one of them barked at the crowd. But the voices only grew stronger. The officers were no longer just dealing with one woman, they were facing the disapproval of an entire group of witnesses. Alicia lifted her head slightly, her eyes finding the faces around her. She saw their concern, their outrage, their compassion. In that moment, she realized she was not alone. These strangers, people she had never met, were standing up for her. It gave her a quiet strength, a reminder that truth had a way of uniting people. The second officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, clearly intending to restrain her. The sight of them caused the crowd to gasp. An elderly woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Don't you dare handcuff her. She's not a criminal." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. The situation was spinning out of control. The whispers among the bystanders grew into a wave of voices, and the recording phones captured every second. The officers' confidence began to waver, but they still held Alicia down, unsure of what else to do. Alicia, despite the pain in her arm, spoke again. Her voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made even the officers pause. "You are making a mistake that you will regret," she said. The words were not shouted, but they cut through the noise like a bell. The crowd went silent for a brief moment, struck by the quiet authority in her tone. It was not the voice of someone begging for mercy, it was the voice of someone who knew her worth, someone who carried an inner strength that could not be crushed. The first officer pulled back slightly, uncomfortable under her gaze. "Why don't you just cooperate?" he muttered. "I have cooperated," Alicia replied firmly. "I gave you my identification. I answered your questions. What more do you want?" The truth of her words hung in the air. The crowd nodded, their anger sharpening. People began to call out directly at the officers. "She told you everything. You're just harassing her. This is going online, you'll be exposed." The officers exchanged nervous looks. For the first time, Alicia saw hesitation flicker across their faces. They were beginning to realize that their actions were not only unjust but also impossible to hide. Still, pride kept them from stepping back. They tightened their grip once more, but the unease in their eyes betrayed them. Alicia sensed it. She could feel the shift, the slow crumble of their false authority under the weight of truth. As the tension thickened, a supervisor arrived on the scene. A taller officer with gray at his temples walked quickly toward the group, his expression stern. The crowd parted slightly, making way for him. The two younger officers straightened, still holding Alicia but looking uneasy under his sharp gaze. "What's going on here?" the supervisor demanded. His tone carried authority, but unlike the others, it wasn't coated with arrogance. The first officer quickly explained, though his words tumbled out awkwardly. "We, received a report about someone suspicious, and, we stopped this woman." The supervisor's eyes narrowed. He looked at Alicia, then at the spilled groceries, then at the crowd of angry faces surrounding them. His jaw tightened. "This woman? Suspicious?" he asked slowly, disbelief dripping from his words. "Yes, sir," the second officer said, though his voice had lost much of its strength. Alicia raised her head, her voice steady but cool. "I told them I was visiting my sister. I showed them my ID. Still, they treated me this way." The crowd erupted again, their voices overlapping, confirming her story. "She told them. She had groceries. They slammed her down for nothing." The supervisor lifted his hand, signaling for silence. His eyes stayed locked on Alicia. Something about the way she spoke, the quiet authority in her tone, made him pause. There was more to this woman than met the eye, he realized. Alicia, though still on the ground, looked directly at him. "Please ask them to release me," she said. "This has gone too far." The supervisor hesitated. He could see the phones recording, the crowd growing restless, the tension threatening to spill over. He nodded reluctantly to the officers. "Let her up." They obeyed, though their movements were stiff, almost reluctant. Alicia rose slowly, brushing the dust from her clothes. Her dignity was intact, even though her body ached from the rough treatment. She stood tall, facing them calmly, her eyes steady. The crowd cheered lightly as she stood. Some clapped, others shouted words of encouragement. Alicia gave a small nod of gratitude toward them before turning back to the officers. At that moment, she decided it was time to reveal a truth that would change everything. Her hand reached into her bag, pulling out a small black wallet. She opened it carefully, showing the badge and identification card inside. The officers froze. Their eyes widened as they read the words, "Federal Judge, United States District Court." The crowd gasped. Whispers spread quickly. "She's a judge. Oh my goodness. Did you hear that?" The two officers who had held her down turned pale. Their faces drained of confidence, replaced by shock and fear. They looked at each other helplessly, realizing the gravity of what they had done. The woman they had shoved to the ground, the one they had treated with arrogance and suspicion, was a federal judge, a figure of immense respect and authority. The supervisor's face tightened. He turned toward his officers with a glare that could cut through steel. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he hissed under his breath. The crowd erupted louder now, some laughing in disbelief, others shaking their heads. Phones captured every second the rough handling, the protest, the revelation. It was a moment that would soon spread far beyond the small town street. Alicia held her badge firmly, her voice calm but sharp. You should have listened when I spoke. You should have respected me as a person, not judged me by assumptions. The officers swallowed hard, panic clear in their eyes. Their arrogance had vanished, replaced by a growing dread of the consequences that awaited them. And in that moment, Alicia stood not just as a judge, but as a living reminder of what justice truly meant: fairness, dignity, and truth that could not be silenced. The moment Alicia revealed her badge, silence fell over the street. The two officers who had forced her down just minutes ago stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their confidence gone. The weight of their mistake pressed down on them harder than the eyes of the crowd. Every bystander who had witnessed the scene now looked at Alicia with awe, not because of her title, but because of the calm strength with which she had carried herself. The supervisor's jaw clenched. He turned sharply toward his officers, his voice low but firm. Do you realize what you've done? This woman is a federal judge. His words struck like a hammer. The younger officers paled, their eyes darting nervously from Alicia to the gathering crowd. Alicia, dust still on her clothes and her arms sore from the rough treatment, stood tall and steady. She did not raise her voice, nor did she lash out in anger. Instead, she let the silence hang, letting the weight of truth settle over everyone present. The power of dignity was stronger than any shouted words. The crowd erupted again, this time louder. A judge, one man exclaimed, shaking his head in disbelief. And they treated her like that. A woman near the front folded her arms tightly across her chest. If they can do this to a judge, what chance does anyone else have? Those words carried heavy meaning. Many in the crowd nodded in agreement. The phones capturing the scene now buzzed with energy, people whispering that the video would soon be everywhere. The first officer finally stammered, We didn't know, ma'am. We had no idea who you were." His voice trembled, all traces of arrogance gone. Alicia fixed her gaze on him, her eyes steady. "That is the problem," she said softly but firmly. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." The words landed with undeniable force. The crowd fell quiet again, absorbing the truth in her statement. Even the supervisor looked down for a moment, uncomfortable at how deeply her words rang out. The second officer stepped forward slightly, his hands shaking. We're sorry," he muttered, but his apology felt weak, almost swallowed by fear. Alicia didn't respond immediately. She took a slow breath, gathering herself. She thought of her sister waiting for her, unaware of what had happened. She thought of the years she had spent working to uphold fairness in her courtroom, teaching young lawyers that justice must never bow to prejudice. Now she stood here, living proof of what she had always believed: dignity was not given by a title, it was a right every person carried. "I don't want your apologies," she said at last, her voice calm. "I want you to understand the harm you've caused. Not just to me, but to every person who will see this and wonder if they, too, will be judged unfairly." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some clapped softly, others whispered words of support. A teenager shouted, "She's right," and several others echoed the sentiment. The supervisor shifted uneasily. He knew the situation was slipping beyond his control. The video recordings would spread quickly, and soon the entire department would be under a harsh spotlight. He turned back to Alicia, his tone softer than before. "Judge Reynolds, please, let us make this right. We didn't know." But Alicia shook her head slightly. "It is not about me being a judge. It's about the way you looked at me, the way you assumed the worst without listening. That cannot be excused by ignorance." Her words cut deeper than anger ever could. The two officers lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze. The crowd watched, some whispering that they hoped justice would reach even those in uniform. As the tension thickened, Alicia bent down and calmly picked up the items that had fallen from her bag. Her hands shook slightly from the ache in her wrists, but she handled each item with care, placing them back into the torn bag. It was a simple act, but in that moment, it symbolized something greater. She was gathering the pieces of dignity that others had tried to scatter. A little boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "She's brave." The mother nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, she is," she replied softly. The supervisor cleared his throat, trying to regain some control of the situation. "Judge Reynolds, may I walk you to your destination?" he asked, his voice now coated with caution and respect. Alicia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That won't be necessary," she replied. "What I need is not an escort. What I need is change. Change in how you see people. Change in how you use your power." Her words lingered in the air, like a quiet command. The crowd nodded again, their agreement rising like a tide. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their pride shattered, their authority shaken. The very people they had tried to impress with their control were now looking at them with disappointment and judgment. The phones continued to record, capturing every tremor in their voices, every uneasy glance. Alicia straightened her shoulders, her presence commanding without force. "This day will follow you," she told them. "Not because I am a judge, but because you forgot that every person deserves respect." The crowd clapped this time, their applause rising in waves. Some cheered her words, others simply stood in silent admiration. Alicia gave them a small nod of gratitude, then turned and began walking toward her sister's home. The crowd parted for her, creating a path. Many reached out to touch her arm gently, offering support. A woman whispered, "Thank you for standing tall." A man said, "You showed us what courage looks like." Behind her, the officers stood frozen, their faces pale with the realization that their careers, their reputations, and their choices had just been altered forever. The supervisor glared at them, his expression heavy with disappointment. As Alicia walked away, the sound of clapping followed her. She didn't look back. Her steps were steady, her head held high. She was not walking as someone who had been humiliated, she was walking as someone who had reclaimed her dignity and turned a moment of injustice into a lesson the entire town would never forget. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy of what they had witnessed lingered in the air. People whispered to each other, promising that the video would be shared, that the truth would not be hidden. Some shook their heads, still in disbelief, while others smiled with admiration at Alicia's strength. At last, she reached her sister's house. When the door opened, her sister gasped at the sight of her dusty clothes and weary face. Alicia simply gave a small smile. "I'll explain inside," she said softly. In the warmth of her sister's living room, with a cup of tea resting on the table, Alicia replayed the events in her mind. She knew the story would soon spread far beyond that quiet street. She knew the officer's panic was only the beginning of a larger storm. But she also knew this: what mattered most was not her title, but her choice to stand with calm dignity in the face of unfairness. She thought about the crowd, the voices that had risen for her, the strangers who had defended her. That, too, was part of the story. It wasn't only about officers making a mistake. It was about ordinary people refusing to stay silent, about dignity shining even when pressed against the pavement. And in that moment, as she sat quietly in her sister's home, Alicia understood that her story was no longer just her own. It was a story that belonged to everyone who believed in fairness, everyone who dreamed of a world where respect was given to every person, no matter who they were. After the incident, the story of Alicia Reynolds spread quickly, far beyond the quiet street where it had begun. The video captured by bystanders went viral online, shared thousands of times across social media. People from all over the country were shocked and inspired. They were shocked that anyone could be treated so unfairly, and inspired by the calm strength Alicia had shown. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting clips of the moment the officers had slammed her to the ground, followed by the moment of revelation when they realized she was a federal judge. Interviews with witnesses filled the airwaves. Every reporter seemed to say the same thing: Alicia's composure and courage had turned a frightening situation into a powerful lesson about respect, dignity, and justice. Despite the attention, Alicia remained grounded. She did not seek fame, nor did she ask for special treatment. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, ensuring that the officers understood the weight of their actions and that the incident could serve as a lesson for everyone. The department issued an official statement. It acknowledged the mistake, expressed regret, and promised a thorough review of the incident. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation took place. Alicia did not demand punishment, but she emphasized that training, awareness, and accountability were necessary to prevent such actions in the future. In the days that followed, Alicia spoke to a group of new recruits at the police academy. She did not speak angrily or bitterly. Instead, she shared her experience as a story, explaining how one moment of poor judgment could have lasting consequences not just for the person harmed, but for the entire community and for the officers themselves. Every action matters, she said, her voice calm but firm. Every person deserves respect. It is not enough to follow orders blindly. It is not enough to act without thought. The world is watching, and every choice you make shapes the trust people place in you. The young officers listened, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding slowly as they absorbed the truth in her words. Alicia had not shamed them in public, she had taught them the most important lesson of all: empathy and awareness are the foundations of justice. At home, Alicia returned to the quiet rhythms of her life, but the impact of the incident continued to grow. Community leaders invited her to speak at events about fairness and equality. Schools asked her to address students about courage and integrity. People who had once only dreamed of standing up for themselves found inspiration in her story. Even in her professional life, the experience shaped her work. In court, she spoke more openly about the importance of empathy, fairness, and understanding the human side of every case. Lawyers who appeared before her noticed a new depth in her judgments, a subtle but powerful insistence that every person, regardless of their background, deserved to be treated with dignity. One afternoon, Alicia visited the street where it had all happened. The corner where she had been forced down was quiet now, but memories lingered. She looked around at the familiar buildings, the small shops, and the sidewalks. She remembered the crowd, the sound of phones clicking, the hushed whispers, and the quiet support of strangers. A young girl ran past, holding her mother's hand. "Mom, that's the lady from the news," she exclaimed. Her mother smiled and nodded. Alicia waved gently, feeling a warm sense of connection. It was moments like these, small and simple, that reminded her of why dignity mattered so much. Alicia knew that change often started with one person standing firm. She remembered the fear she had felt when the officers had approached, the pain of being slammed to the ground, and the adrenaline that had surged through her body. But she also remembered the calm that had followed, the realization that her actions in that moment could ripple far beyond herself. Community members continued to rally around the idea of respect and understanding. Local leaders introduced programs to improve police training, emphasizing communication, cultural awareness, and the importance of treating every person with humanity. Workshops were held, discussions were organized, and slowly, change began to take root. Alicia's story became a teaching tool in law schools and police academies. Professors used the video not as a means of shaming officers, but as an example of the power of integrity, courage, and calm under pressure. Students debated, wrote essays, and discussed how they would have acted in her place. At the department itself, internal reforms were introduced. Officers were encouraged to reflect on their biases, to question assumptions, and to remember that authority came with responsibility. Alicia had not sought to be a hero, but her presence had inspired a shift that no training manual alone could achieve. Meanwhile, Alicia returned to her personal life, finding comfort in the small joys she often took for granted. She spent afternoons with her sister, helping her garden, cooking meals together, and talking late into the evening about everything and nothing. She spent weekends volunteering at a local youth center, speaking to teenagers about their futures, the importance of honesty, and the strength that comes from standing up for what is right. In her reflections, Alicia realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She understood that dignity was not a fragile thing, it could be preserved even in the face of injustice, and that every person had the ability to protect it, no matter how powerless they might feel in a moment. Months passed, and the officers who had confronted her faced consequences appropriate to the situation. They were not shunned entirely, rather, they were guided toward understanding and growth. Alicia believed in accountability, but also in the possibility of learning and change. She saw that even those who had acted wrongly could find a path toward improvement if given guidance and the chance to reflect. The public continued to discuss the incident, often returning to the same idea: courage, calm, and dignity could have far-reaching effects. People wrote letters, shared stories, and spoke about how Alicia's example had encouraged them to stand up in their own lives, whether for themselves, their neighbors, or their communities. One evening, as she sat by the window in her sister's home, Alicia watched the sunset paint the sky in gold and orange. She thought about the street where it all began, the moment that had seemed terrifying at the time, and how it had turned into a story of hope, learning, and change. She smiled softly, knowing that her experience, though difficult, had become something far larger than herself. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, and community members. Many simply said, "Thank you," or, "You inspire us." She read each one with a quiet sense of fulfillment, understanding that the impact of her actions would continue to grow in ways she might never fully see. Alicia's life returned to its rhythms, but she moved through the world with an added awareness. Every interaction, every glance, every choice became an opportunity to reflect the dignity and respect she had fought to reclaim. She treated each person she met with patience, fairness, and understanding, knowing that even small acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing the world in ways no one could predict. And so, Alicia Reynolds' story ended not in anger or fear, but in growth and inspiration. She became more than a federal judge, she became a symbol of courage, calm strength, and the enduring power of dignity. Her experience reminded everyone who heard it that no matter the situation, the choices we make in moments of difficulty define not only us but the world around us. In the hearts of those who witnessed her ordeal, and those who later heard of it, Alicia's example lived on. A lesson in respect, fairness, and courage had been written not in books alone, but in action, in the life of a woman who refused to be diminished, and who showed that integrity could shine, even in the darkest of moments. The story of Alicia Reynolds was no longer just a moment on a street corner. It became a story of hope, a story of justice, and a story of the enduring power of dignity, one that would be told for years to come, inspiring countless others to stand tall, speak calmly, and act with unwavering integrity.